Okay, thank you. So we'll have missed that introduction, but just a personal note about this choice of topic. Um, for those who don't know, I was a PhD student in Jewish studies before becoming a lawyer, and it was really a class about Maimonides that reinvigorated my interest in Jewish studies. I had attended a Jewish day school, so I was familiar with Jewish texts and some aspects of Jewish thought. But in my senior year of college, I took a class with Professor Warren Zev Harvey, who was an American who had made Aliyah, was visiting from Hebrew University. It was a seminar at the University of Pennsylvania, and it was all about the Guide of the Perplexed. That is Maimonides' great philosophical work. I had not read it previously, knew very little about Maimonides or the Guide before that class. And it was a really stimulating class that prompted me to want to pursue Jewish studies further, which then led into my doctoral program. I discovered after the fact, or maybe during the class, I didn't know this beforehand, but that Professor Harvey is one of the great Maimonidean scholars in the world. I've relied in significant part on his scholarship in preparing for this class. So I had the privilege of learning with one of the great Maimonides scholars without even knowing it. But that's what really prompted my interest in this topic. And the format here, I'm going to, in a moment, share my source sheet. I'm going to lecture based on those sources, and then I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions. So if you can hold and remember your questions till the end, I would appreciate that. So with that, let me share my source sheet. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. The title of the class, as you see, is From Moses to Moses There Rose None Like Moses. That is a quotation from Maimonides' tombstone, meaning from Moses of the Bible, Moshe Rabbeinu, to Moses Maimonides. There was no one else in between who was as great as Maimonides since the biblical Moses. And I've subtitled it, Was Maimonides the greatest Jew of all time or a heretic? I will give you a preview of my answer that I think he is one of the most significant Jews in all of Jewish history, both intellectually and religiously. But there were those who believed that some of his views were heretical. And we will get into that in more detail in a subsequent session. But I want to actually give you a taste of the vitriolic debate that attended Maimonides' thought. Right as we start, really without too much context, we will get back to why people felt so strongly both in opposition to his thought and in defense of it. But the first text I want to focus on is the text of an excommunication ban, a cherem, by the Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Abraham or ben Adret, who was the greatest Talmudic authority of his time in the early, here he lived in the 13th and early 14th century in Spain. And he was sort of brought into the fray. He actually had mystical tendencies, Kabbalistic tendencies. We're going to get back to that entire issue of the interplay, the dynamic between Maimonides and Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. Maimonides was not a mystic, but he precipitated the development of Kabbalistic thought, I will argue. But this was 100 years. I'm going to get back to a biography in just a moment. I'll give you a biography of Maimonides, but even before doing that, I wanted to give you a sense of the controversy that attended Maimonidean thought. This was issued almost exactly 100 years after Maimonides' death. So these issues were brewing for quite a long time. The greatest Talmudic authority in the Jewish world at the time, Rashba, in Spain, issued a cherem really directed against the Jews of the southern France region along the border with the Iberian Peninsula. And there were several rounds of the Maimonidean controversies. This was really the fourth and final round. And this is the text of what the Rashba wrote. This is not about Maimonides himself, but it is directed at 100 years later at his followers who were very philosophically inclined. I'll get back to subsequently about sort of what was objectionable about what they were doing. But I want you to hear the harshness of the decree. All Israel is required to excommunicate these sinners, these Maimonidean followers. Until their death, they shall not atone for this transgression. The fire of Gehenna, the hellish underworld, will be extinguished, but the bodies of these sinners will not be consumed. Upon their bodies, the flame will never go out. Regarding the books that any one of those among them wrote, sort of philosophically inclined books, we judge its owner a heretic and the books as the books of the magicians. It's not good to be a magician in Jewish thought. They and anyone who owns them stand in excommunication until they burn them completely and no longer mention their contents, following the commandment of the Torah regarding the statues of their gods, to burn with fire and erase their name from memory. But he adds as a caveat, one who repents and regrets will receive mercy from heaven. So that is the harshness of the cherem that went out against Maimonidean followers who were engaged in the project of integrating philosophy and Torah. Again, I'll get back to all of the underlying issues subsequently. But here's a letter of Yedaya Hapnini in defense of those Maimonidean Jews. He was one of them. Yedaya became a significant poet, astronomer, mathematician, but in defense of Maimonidean Jews and really in response to the cherem issued by Rashba, he wrote, even if Joshua ben Nun, so the Joshua of the Torah, Moses' successor, were to command them, meaning the followers of Maimonidean philosophy, to abandon the philosophical study of Torah, they would not obey, for they intend to do battle for the honor of the great rabbi. That's how they referred to Maimonides and his books. So long as life's breath is in their nostrils, they will sacrifice their wealth, their offspring, and their very lives for the sanctification of his teaching, and in this manner shall they instruct their children throughout the generations. So this is really a spirited and really a visceral response to the ban of the Rashba. At this point, 100 years after Maimonides' death, for many Jews, philosophy was an integral part of the study of Torah and could not be sort of put to the side. And even if the Guide to the Perplexed itself was not the subject of the ban, one had to, for these Jews, these philosophically inclined Jews, one had to study philosophy in order to understand Maimonides, which is in itself was part of the new agenda. And I didn't include here, but there were even bans issued against those who would issue bans against the philosophically inclined. So there were competing bans. And these controversies lasted, for a couple of centuries in the aftermath of Maimonides' life. So let's turn to that. I want to give you a short biography of Maimonides so you have a sense of the background of what we'll be discussing. You see his dates are 1138 to 1204. I will note, I remember his dates, and it's useful to keep in mind. Maimonides was born almost exactly 100 years after Rashi. Rashi's years, for some reason, I remember them, 1040 to 1105. Maimonides, almost everything that occurred in Maimonides' life happened sort of 100 years, a century later. I say here, by consensus, he is one of the most influential Jews who ever lived. I believe that to be the case. One can come up with a list of the most important Jews of all time. I think Maimonides would certainly be high on that list. Traditional Jews refer to him as Rambam, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon. That's just the acronym based on his name and his father's name. Maimonides, I'll refer to him generally as Maimonides. In certain halachic contexts, I'll refer to him as the Rambam. Was born in Spain, but he fled as a young boy or as a young man with his family due to pressure and persecution of a very onerous sect of Muslims an onerous, rigid sect of Islam had taken over the Iberian Peninsula. They wanted Jews to convert. So Maimonides' family fled with him first to Morocco, and later he ended up in Egypt, which is where he settled. His most important works are the Jewish legal work of the Mishnah Torah, which, if that's all Maimonides had ever written in his life, he would still be a giant of the Jewish tradition. The Mishnah Torah is really the only fully encyclopedic and all-encompassing compendium of rabbinic law, meaning it addresses issues that are only sort of theoretical in nature in light of the destruction of the temple. Maimonides thought it was important to incorporate those laws as well. So in contrast, for example, the Shulchan Aruch, the later compendium of Jewish law based in part on the Mishnah Torah, did not cover all of the topics that were reflected in the Mishnah Torah. So on the halachic, the Jewish legal side, the Mishnah Torah is a crucially important work that is still studied in yeshivas today. And then on the other side of the ledger, the Guide of the Perplexed is perhaps the most important Jewish philosophical work of all time. And I underline this, it's a highly influential integration of Torah and philosophy. We'll get back to that. But I underline integration as opposed to synthesis. In a synthesis, the thesis and antithesis come together, but each of them is sort of overcome in a new synthesis. With Maimonides, I believe that the proper interpretation of what he was doing is that his rabbinic capacity and his philosophical mode were really consistent with each other and can be understood coherently and not in opposition to each other. So those are his two most important works. He wrote various other things, a treatise on logic, an earlier commentary on the Mishnah, a really interesting book, the Sefer HaMitzvot, in which he lists the 613 commandments, and there's debate about what commandments should be included among the 613, but he provides, a sort of rationale or a background for each of the mitzvot, and there's an important introduction. There are important notes on the Book of Commandments written by Nachmanides that perhaps in another year I'll focus on because they're quite interesting. He was a physician, so he wrote various medical treatises. I have no expertise in medicine, and I'm not going to cover those, but he wrote important treatises that apparently were still studied for centuries after his lifetime. And then we have extant, really significant correspondence and responsa between Maimonides and various Jewish communities throughout the Jewish world. All of his major works were written in Judeo-Arabic, which was the language of the time within the Muslim Empire, except for the crucial halachic code, the Mishnah Torah, which was written in Hebrew. He was a Jewish legal decisor, a philosopher, a physician, an astronomer, but also, importantly, he didn't divorce himself from issues of the Jewish community. He was an important communal leader who various Jewish communities reached out to him for his advice, for his intervention in times of distress. On the medical side, he rose to a very important position as the personal physician to Saladin in the Muslim court in Egypt. I note that he was deeply affected by the drowning of his brother David, who is his business partner. David really ran the family business while Maimonides did all the other things that he was doing, but tragically his brother died in a shipwreck. And I note that Maimonides named his only son Abraham, which, as we'll see, I believe is not coincidental. I've already touched on the Maimonidean controversies. They ensued for a couple of hundred years, sporadically after his death. We will get back to the underlying issues in those controversies. I'm not going to address them today, but they involved biblical allegory, the place of philosophy in Jewish life, and the 13 principles of faith that Maimonides issued as a young man. We'll get back to whether Maimonides really sort of stuck to those principles. And as I noted before, there were these very vitriolic competing bands of excommunication that accompanied the sort of coverage of what Maimonidean followers were doing. I'll end with this part, which is, this really goes to the overall theme of what my presentations are going to seek to show about Maimonides, that there's really a paradox. There's almost no one else within traditional Judaism who has the stature and status and prestige of Maimonides. Almost all traditional Jews look up to him, rely on the Mishnah Torah, and think very highly of him. But paradoxically, as I'm going to present it, Maimonides, I think, was really trying to radically reform the Judaism of his day, but he generally failed. So despite his immense stature within the tradition, perhaps unequaled in post-Talmudic Judaism, the reforms that he really tried to circulate among Jews to the extent feasible did not take hold to the extent that Maimonides would have wanted. So, as I say here, he sought to refine Judaism of its idolatrous elements, and I will argue really of its sort of proto-Kabbalistic elements, but he didn't succeed in doing it. So despite having what I say is an unimpeachable reputation among traditional Jews, if you go into any yeshiva, everyone there will think highly of Maimonides, but in the traditional world, his views are often either misunderstood, reinterpreted to suit people's own vision of what Maimonides should have said in light of what they understand Jewish tradition to be, or they either ignore things about his thought that they find unsettling or subversive, or they are just ignorant about what he actually said. So there are a lot of misconceptions about Maimonides' views. I'm going to present a certain version of him that I think is true and accurate, but it doesn't comport necessarily with the way a lot of traditional Jews understand Maimonides. And I note here at the end that mainstream traditional Judaism is largely not Maimonidean. It's really been infiltrated by a lot of the sort of proto-Kabbalistic mystical elements that I think Maimonides really did not favor, but he was not able ultimately to overcome. So those are sort of elements of my overall presentation that we're going to touch on today and get back to. The paradox of Maimonides being immensely prestigious within the Jewish tradition, but ultimately not particularly successful in sort of circulating among the masses the type of Judaism that he favored. Okay, so on that point, the point of Maimonides' radical reform or improvement, refinement of Judaism, largely being unsuccessful, I want to start with something very basic, but I think that might surprise you, which is Shalom Aleichem, what we sing every Friday evening. For those who don't know, Shalom Aleichem was written by the mystics of Tzfat, probably in the late 16th century, and one might think that there's just no controversy about Shalom Aleichem. Traditional Jews sing it, even non-traditional Jews sing it, and I want to focus on the third stanza, which, as you know, it's Baruch Hu Shalom Malachei HaShalom, right? Everyone knows that melody. Everyone knows those words. I don't know if you've thought about it, but let me just say straightforwardly, I believe, so this was written after Maimonides' life. Maimonides would have thought this stanza is heretical. And he would have thought, if you actually believe this, you have forfeited your share in the world to come, in Olam Haba. In the English, bless me with peace, messengers of peace, referring to the angels, messengers of God. So this, we say it perhaps sort of mindlessly, but it really is asking for angelic intervention on our behalf with God. Now, why would Maimonides find that highly problematic and objectionable? Because this is not the actual principle. What this implicates is his fifth principle of faith. He issued 13, again, early in his writing career. He may not have adhered to them completely in his later life, meaning he didn't necessarily think they were all dogmas. But this is from the Mishnah Torah. The essence of the commandment forbidding the worship of false gods is not to serve any of the creations, not an angel, a sphere, or a star, nor any entity created from them. I just skipped over a little bit of the sort of Greek philosophical reference. This implies that the thoughts of your heart should not lead you astray to worship these and make them an intermediary between you and the Creator. I believe, and I'm not the first to say this, that Maimonides would have had a problem with the third stanza of Shalom Aleichem, in which we are addressing as intermediaries these angels of peace as intermediaries between us and God. Maimonides, if you come away with nothing else today, I want you to realize that Maimonides had a vigorous, strict, austere, and really uncompromising sense of monotheism. He didn't want Jews to have in mind or care about anything but God. So he wasn't a fan of angels. He wasn't a fan, certainly not of demons. And these are all part of Jewish tradition, undoubtedly. You open the Talmud, you'll see references, and the Torah, you'll see references to angels and demons. Maimonides tried to sort of uncomplicate the universe and have Jews focus on God exclusively. I will say that in addition to Shalom Aleichem, there are probably a couple of other elements of our traditional liturgy that Maimonides, based on this principle of faith that we should be focused really exclusively on God, that he would have found objectionable. One, our slichot that we say during the high holiday season, traditional slichot, some of them address angels directly, which Maimonides would have found problematic. And then I even found a reference that I think is interesting that I had never thought of before, even in benching, where we say, Bamarom Yelamdu Aleihem Aleinu Zechut, that we're sort of referring to angels above, that they should intercede on our behalf to our merit. I've never thought about that as being problematic, but Maimonides likely would have found that to be problematic as well. But the important thing to keep in mind is Maimonides' strict monotheism really goes against the grain of Jewish tradition, in which, yes, we believe in one God, but the rabbinic tradition is filled with references to angels, to demons, and the popular masses of Jewry through the centuries probably believed in all of those various intermediaries. I will argue that I think that played out and found a place in Kabbalistic thought that Maimonides was trying to sort of suppress, but ultimately was unsuccessful in overcoming. All right, let me then turn to, with that background of, I gave you a sense of the vitriolic debate, gave you a sense of elements of contemporary Jewish life that Maimonides might have found objectionable based on his rigid, austere, uncompromising monotheism. Let me turn to some threshold issues. This first issue is really so basic. What does it mean to be Jewish? And part of that is, what does it mean for us to be holy? So this is just a sample bracha. I could have chosen any blessing from within the Jewish tradition. I chose this one about the bracha that we say when we're about to study Torah. But every time we say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to do whatever the task or event is that we're we're making a blessing about. Um, what do those words mean? Asher kiddeshanu b'mitzvotav, who sanctified us with his commandments. There are at least two options. One is that because we are Jews and because we receive the Torah, because we have this set of commandments, we are already inherently holy as a result of being within this system. That's one option. And I believe that's not the option that Maimonides endorsed. It's what the option that the alternative option that Maimonides endorsed was that commandments make us holy. As Jews, we don't start as holy. We have no sort of default advantage of being Jewish in terms of holiness. What it means to be Jewish is to take on this system, the Jewish legal system, take on the yoke of the commandments, and only through that process. By the way, we'll get back to it. That's not self-sufficient in terms of what we need to do as human beings, but as Jews, it's only by doing the commandments that we become holy. We have no inherent holiness by default. And that gets me to the next source. This is a famous source from the book of Leviticus. Famous phrase, speak to the whole Israelite community and say to them, you shall be holy. I bolded those words in English. In Hebrew, kadoshim tihiyu. So just two Hebrew words, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And I think interpretations of this really fundamental phrase about the agenda for us to be holy, interpretations have differed about what that means, and really those differing interpretations go to the core of underlying conceptions of Judaism. And on the one hand, one option, again, that Maimonides did not favor is embodied in the thought of Yehuda Halevi, who preceded Maimonides, was a really important Jewish thinker as well. We could have a whole class on the thought of Yehuda Halevi. But I think for Yehuda Halevi, this is really sort of a promise, an assurance. That's the way he interpreted it, that as Jews, we will be holy. Kedoshim to you. It's almost like in the future tense, because you are Jews, you will inevitably become holy. Yehuda Halevi had a very sort of racial genetic conception of Jewishness. He had a problem, I think, with converts, as an example. So for him, Kedoshim to you, you shall be holy, was really sort of a guarantee by God. That's not the way Maimonides read it. For Maimonides, the project of holiness was a challenge for us, a mandate. That was the objective for us, that we could attain through the study of Torah and the study of philosophy. We'll get to all of that, but there was no assurance involved. For Maimonides, there was no inherent attribute of holiness that we Jews have as an advantage over anyone else. And by the way, that's just as an important accompanying note, that speaks to very different conceptions of chosenness. We'll get to this, but for Yehuda Halevi, I think he believed that God really had no choice but to choose the Jews as God's people, because we did have this sort of sense of holiness about us. God really had no choice but to choose us. For Maimonides, that was not the case. Again, Jews, relative to other human beings, have no inherent sort of hardwired advantage. These are all texts that through which I'm hoping to introduce very basic, important foundational elements of Maimonidean thought, so that we can get into some of the details further in subsequent sessions. But this is it's not only crucial in the Jewish tradition, but really important for Maimonides. This comes from the first book of the Torah, Genesis. God said, let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness. And verse 27 says, and God created humankind in the divine image, creating it in the image of God. Vayivra Elohim et Adam b'tzelmo b'tzelem Elohim bara oto. So that is one of the most important verses in the Torah, but it's more important to some Jewish thinkers than to others. And I think it was crucially important to Maimonides. For him, this verse indicated that Jews share humanity in kind with all other human beings. The beginning of the book of Genesis is about humanity. It's not about Jews. And the fact that all human beings were created in the divine image, meaning for Maimonides, by the way, again, we'll get back to this concept, that we are all rational beings with the potential for intellectual perfection. And we Jews share that in kind with everyone else. Every human being, in theory, has the capacity to reach his or her full potential in sort of knowing God in the right way. And the book of Genesis establishes that equivalency among all human beings without giving any particular advantage to Jews. So with that fundamental principle of the common humanity and equality among all human beings, if everyone could just please mute their computer or phone, please. Let me get to sort of another threshold issue. How do we, as Jews, or even really as human beings, more importantly, fulfill our potential in Maimonides' eyes? And I will just say at the beginning of this next set of texts that for Maimonides, beyond Moses of the Bible was certainly the height of prophetic perfection for Maimonides, but before that, really, Abraham was really an ideal person in Maimonides' view, and I'll hopefully explain that over the next few minutes. But keep in mind that Abraham, near the beginning of Genesis, was not a Jew. There was no Judaism then. He was a human being who had an encounter with God. We read in Parshat Lech Lecha, the Lord said to Abram, he was Avram then without the hay, so he was not yet Avraham. Go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. This is a very famous beginning, the first encounter between God and I'll call him Abraham. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. What I want you to focus on here is really when you're reading the Bible, when you're reading the book of Genesis, this really seems to come almost out of the blue. There's some prior reference at the end of the prior Torah portion that gives some hint of this. But other than that hint, it really sort of comes out of the blue, this command, this instruction from God to Abraham to leave his father's land and to go to the place that to the promised land, essentially, that God will show him. But there's no backdrop, there's no background, there's no backstory to Abraham's mission. We really have no clear sense of why God chose Abraham. Based on the story of the Torah, we only know about Abraham from subsequent verses and passages. But the initial mandate to Abraham seems to come from God, comes out of the blue. Now, the rabbis in subsequent centuries tried to fill in the background, the backstory, fill in the narrative gaps. So here's an example from Breshit Rabbah, a later book of rabbinic midrash. Rabbi Yitzchak said, and about this verse about God telling Avram to go to the promised land, this is analogous to one who was passing from place to place and saw a building with a candle or a fire burning in it. The person said, is it possible that this building has no one in charge of it? Because he didn't see anyone there. He just saw a candle or a fire burning in it, but didn't see any human being in the vicinity. The owner of the building looked out at him and said, I am the owner of the building, answering the question of, was there someone there? So, because Abraham, our patriarch, was saying, is it possible that this world is without someone in charge? Now, so this is already filling in the gaps. The Torah itself has no indication that Abraham was sort of discovering monotheism at the time that he was chosen by God for this mission. The rabbis have stories about Abraham's background, that he had already discovered monotheism. He was trying to impress on his fellow Mesopotamians the importance of monotheism, but the Torah says nothing about that backstory. But importantly, the rabbinic midrash says, because Abraham started to ask, oh, does this world have like an owner to it? The Holy One, blessed be he, looked at him and said to Abraham, I am the owner of the world. So in this rabbinic telling of the backstory, Abraham does show initiative about discovering monotheism, but then God reaches out to him and sort of gives him a direct answer. Yes, you're wondering, Abraham, who's in charge? I'm telling you, I'm speaking directly to you. God is saying, I am the owner of the world. So that's the rabbinic midrash that was well known to Jews. But look how Maimonides really reworks and transforms that rabbinic midrash. So we go from the Torah that has nothing about the backstory to rabbinic midrash that has a backstory that includes God reaching out to Abraham and answering his questions and sort of revealing his mighty presence to Abraham. This is how, instead, or as a twist, but important spin on the story, Maimonides tells the backstory in the Mishnah Torah, his great work of Jewish law. By the way, the fact that Maimonides has philosophical and narrative elements in his great book of Jewish law is itself noteworthy. But he writes in the Mishnah Torah, this is Maimonides, after this mighty man, so that's Abraham, was weaned, so even as a young boy, he began to explore and think. Though he was a child, he began to think incessantly throughout the day and night, wondering, how is it possible for the sphere to continue to revolve without having anyone controlling it? Who is causing it to revolve? Surely it does not cause itself to revolve. Abraham had no teacher, nor was there anyone to inform him. Rather, he was mired in Ur-Kasdim. Remember, this is in Mesopotamia, outside the Promised Land, among the foolish idolaters, including his family. His father, mother, and all the people around him were idol worshippers, and he would worship with them. However, his heart was exploring and gaining understanding. Ultimately, he appreciated the way of truth and understood the path of righteousness through his accurate comprehension. Abraham, realized that there was one God who controlled the sphere, that he created everything, and that there was no other God among all the other entities. He knew that the entire world was making a mistake, would cause them to err was their service of the stars and images, which made them lose awareness of the truth. So in Maimonides' retelling of the backstory, Abraham is this sort of restless, lonely, dissident intellectual who discovers God solely, exclusively through his own initiative. What is absent in Maimonides' retelling of the rabbinic midrash? If you remember, the end of the midrash, God reaches out to Abraham and tells Abraham, sort of answers his question, addresses his wonderment, and says, Abraham, I, God, am the owner of the world. That intervention, that intercession, that reaching out by God is totally absent in Maimonides' retelling of Abraham's backstory. In Maimonides' retelling, Abraham does everything by himself as a non-Jew, without the aid of Torah. There's no sense of God teaching him Torah, which is that's present in other rabbinic texts, that our forefathers practiced Torah, studied in yeshivas. There's no, anachronistically, of course, but there's no sense at all of that in the Maimonidean telling. Abraham, through his own hard work, through his own sense of studying the natural world, we'll get back to this, but that's crucial to Maimonides, that Abraham began to think and look at the natural world and sort of scientifically came to the conclusion that there was a God, there must be a God that controlled it. And that was his marvelous discovery of monotheism. But again, when he discovered it, he was not a Jew. He did it without the aid of any Torah. He did it without the assistance of any divine intervention. So for Maimonides, Abraham is really a role model for us, but he's an intellectual, ideological role model in terms of the heritage that he bequeathed to us. Um, it's not a genetic or race-based heritage. Um, Anyone in the world, Jew or non-Jew, can follow Abraham's model and reach similar levels of comprehension and truths about the nature of the world and of God, which for Maimonides was no atheist. He was everything revolves around the intellectual knowledge of God in Maimonides' system. But what I want to really highlight here is that it's a universalistic sense of the accessibility of religious and intellectual truths. You don't have to be Jewish. You don't, frankly, even need the Torah. As I'll explain, the Torah helps, but non-Jews can also reach very high levels of intellectual and religious wisdom about the world. Okay, so with that in mind, with Abraham as the role model, Maimonides sets out really what is our purpose in life. And for Maimonides, because we are rational beings, because we have a mind, and Maimonides believed we should use our minds to the greatest extent possible, and he reached incredible levels of intellectual insight. But the very first passage of his great work, the Mishnah Torah, indicates, and it's also, by the way, the first commandment in his book of the commandments, Sefer HaMitzvot, all goes back to this project that he wants all Jews and believes all human beings are obligated to engage in, which is the intellectual knowledge of the world and of God as a result, who is the primary cause of everything in the world. But the Mishnah Torah, his great work of Jewish law, starts out, the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of wisdom is to know. So this is obligatory upon us to figure out that there is a primary being who brought into being all existence, meaning God. All the beings of the heavens, the earth, and what is between them came into existence only from the truth of his being. So for Maimonides, the foundation of all true knowledge is God's role in the universe, and that true knowledge is available, accessible, open to everyone, and not only open to everyone, but obligatory on everyone. That is the purpose of human life, is to use our brains, use the mind that God has granted us to understand as clearly as we can the intricacies of the world around us. And all of that is sort of predicated on our knowing and understanding that God brought about everything. And just to make clear that this is not this project of developing knowledge about the world and about God that is at the root of Maimonides' whole philosophical system is not easy work. It is demanding. In the Guide of the Perplexed, his great philosophical work, Maimonides wrote, "There is no belief without thinking. For to believe is to hold that things beyond the mind are as we think them." So we're not just supposed to believe in things, we're supposed to rationally conclude things that will lead us to having informed beliefs about the world and about God. If we reach a belief that's incontestable and cannot be gainsaid or contradicted, its falsity being inconceivable, we've reached certainty. And that's the goal. We're supposed to develop informed beliefs about the world, not just his. Now, I'll get back to this, but he was fairly elitist about his views of what the Jewish masses could really sort of tolerate. But ideally, so far, I'm just talking about his sort of ideal human goal is for each of us to develop, to the extent feasible, our rational minds. But it's hard work. It's not just to believe something without going through the process of trying to deduce the underlying conclusions for ourselves. And further, there is a very sort of natural symbiotic relationship between our developing knowledge of God and our loving God, which is really the ultimate goal, is to love God. For Maimonides, according to the knowledge of God will be the love of God. If the former, if the knowledge of God be little or much, so will the latter, the love of God, be little or much. A person ought therefore to devote himself to the understanding and comprehension of those sciences and studies that will inform him concerning his master, again with the caveat, as far as it lies in human faculties to understand and comprehend. Maimonides understood that there are limitations both generally with respect to humankind, but also from one person to another about the extent of their ability to sort of master knowledge about the natural world. But it's hard to exaggerate the importance of what this is. And this may, I may be saying things, and I will definitely be saying things about Maimonides that you think may not even sound Jewish. But Maimonides, his view of Judaism as a philosopher and as a Jewish legal decisor. This passage, for example, is from the Mishnah Torah. The prior one was from the Guide of the Perplexed, but those two go hand in hand. His sense of philosophy, his sense of Judaism are really integrated or cohesive or coherent for Maimonides. The place, so it's hard to exaggerate the place of scientific knowledge, of studying the outside world. Maimonides believed by studying the outside world, we will come to better understand God and gain an appreciation of the fact that God is the cause of everything beyond us. Okay, moving to another sort of threshold issue, another foundational question. Again, I'm just trying to give you some insight into some of the really essential elements of Maimonidean thought that will develop in more detail in subsequent sessions. But I'm going back to the very beginning of the Torah here. The question is, why does the Torah begin the way it does? Perhaps we take it for granted that the Torah starts with the creation of the world. But it didn't have to start that way. And the answer one gives really depends on how one views the nature and purpose of the Torah itself. So the fact that it's not inevitable that the Torah would have started with the creation story is because the great biblical commentator Rashi, the very first thing he says in his commentary, Rashi says, he quotes Rabbi Isaac, but Rashi is endorsing this view. The Torah should have commenced with the verse from Exodus chapter 12, verse 2. This month shall be unto you the first of the months, which is the first commandment given to the people of Israel. So Rashi is basically saying the Torah underlying this statement is his view. The Torah is a legal work. It's halachic in purpose. So why didn't we just start with the first commandment, which is really sort of the point of the whole Torah, is that God is giving us commandments. For Rashi, the question presumes that we could have just skipped the entire book of Genesis and the first, 11 chapters of Exodus. Why not just start with the first mitzvah? So Rashi goes on, what is the reason then that it actually commences with the account of the creation of the world? And Rashi's answer is, for should the peoples, and this is a very famous Rashi, of course, the first one, for should the peoples of the world say to Israel, you are robbers because you took by force the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan, when the Israelites conquered the land of Canaan from the people who lived there, Israel may reply to them, all the earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be He. He created it. So that's why we have the story of creation. It shows that God created the world and gave it to whom He pleased. When He willed it, He gave the land to the Canaanites. And when He willed it, subsequently, He took it from them and gave it to us. So Rashi's answer is, the Torah begins with the story of creation just really for the purpose of showing that the Jews were entitled to the land of Israel, and essentially that the Jews should practice it. All of this was given, was recounted so that the Jews will know they should practice the Torah in the land of Israel. For Rashi, though, the underlying assumption is that the Torah is a halachic work. We might as well have started with the first commandment. According to Rashi, you have to come up with a reason why we had a creation story at all. That's a very famous Rashi. You know, it's a Rashi is highly influential himself, so that is widely known. That view is widely known. But Maimonides has a competing reason for why the Torah starts with a story of the creation. And Maimonides is, again, remember, I noted that he lived about 100 years after Rashi. Maimonides is essentially saying, no, Rashi, you're wrong. There's not a parochial Jewish purpose to beginning the book of Genesis with a creation story. It's a universal one that goes to the purpose of humanity's existence in this world. I'll read this, but just the sort of overall message is that the book of Genesis teaches us correct theological beliefs about God through this creation story, which is meant not to be taken literally, but to provoke us to want to study the natural world in order to understand God better. And Maimonides in the Guide to the Perplexed, this is right near the beginning of his great philosophical masterpiece, The Guide. He writes, God, you see, chose to improve us and enhance our lives in society with his practical norms. Those are really the commandments. So the commandments are designed to sort of provide a certain framework and stability in our society that will improve us ethically and socially. But this could not be done without our reaching certain intellectual convictions, chiefly in awareness of God so far as we are able. So interesting, the mitzvot really will not fulfill their own agenda, their purpose for us, unless we have pre-existing certain correct beliefs, informed beliefs in mind. And those beliefs depend on metaphysics, theological knowledge, which is won only after study of natural science. So again, this may sound foreign to you, but this is what Maimonides believed, that we have to be good scientists in order to be good metaphysicians, in order to understand anything about God, which for Maimonides is the purpose of our existence. We have to understand more, or as much as we can, about the natural world. For physics borders on metaphysics and is its prerequisite. And that's the point of Maaseh Bereshit, the story of the creation of the world with which Genesis begins, is to provoke us to learn more about the natural sciences. So one might ask, okay, if that's the case, Maimonides, why doesn't the Torah speak in philosophical language? Why doesn't it just teach us those philosophical truths that it's sort of hinting at? Why does it give us this creation story that only sort of leads us in the direction of true knowledge? Maimonides answers, given its immensity and sublimity and our incapacity to grasp such ultimate truths themselves, the profundities that divine wisdom saw we need were broached obliquely and poetically in words quite baffling. So Maimonides is saying the Torah speaks in sort of poetic, esoteric language because we need that, or at least most Jews need that. And he also attributes the same quality of writing esoterically and poetically to the sages. As the sages say, to convey to flesh and blood the power of the creative act is impossible, so the Torah began the way it did, alerting you that these things are ineffable. They're very difficult to understand. And then he quotes from Ecclesiastes, King Solomon said the same thing. Everything about it is couched in multivalent terms, so the masses take it as best their limited understanding permits, but the learned and astute take it otherwise. So I mentioned this, but one of his, I believe one of his flaws was that Maimonides was quite an elitist. He did believe that generally the Jewish masses had very limited capacity to understand the sorts of theological and real and religious truths that he was trying to get the more sophisticated among the community to appreciate. And that's why the Torah itself, and that's why the rabbis themselves, and that's why Maimonides himself, following those prior models, writes the guide of the perplexed in a very sort of oblique way. It's not always clear how to pinpoint what he's actually trying to say. But it's because Maimonides thought there were only a few among us who could grapple properly with these deep theological truths. And those truths could be unsettling to the Jewish masses. So he rejects Rashi's understanding of the sort of parochially halachic framework for the beginning of Genesis and says, no, it's a universalistic human beginning. All human beings have the capacity to understand the natural sciences and in turn, therefore gain a better understanding of God. Another example of Maimonides' approach to seeking truth, one can answer, okay, so our mandate is to develop intellectual knowledge of the world and consequently of God's place in it. What are the sources of that knowledge? And this is a very famous passage from Maimonides. I find this perspective very appealing. This is his commentary to Pirkei Avot, which the sort of ethical work of the rabbis. Maimonides writes in that introduction to the Shmona Prakim, the 8 chapters, know that the things about which we shall speak in these chapters and in what will come in the commentary are not matters invented on my own, nor explanations I have originated. Indeed, they are matters gathered from the discourse of the sages in the Midrash, the Talmud, and other compositions of theirs. And listen to this, as well as from the discourse of both the ancient and modern philosophers. He doesn't say Jewish philosophers. Generally, he refers to philosophers, and from the compositions of many men. Hear the truth from whoever says it. So that's a famous line from Maimonides, and the message he's giving his readers is you can accept the truth or pursue truth even from non-Jewish sources. Maimonides was incredibly well read. He read almost everything that existed in his time within the Jewish tradition. But he was, and we'll get to this, he was a master of ancient Greek philosophy. He was an Aristotelian in terms of his approach to understanding philosophy, but he also was intimately familiar with Islamic philosophy of his time. I think the historical evidence shows that he was probably had communications with Muslim theologians as well, and he was certainly influenced by certain Islamic philosophy. And Maimonides is trying to encourage his Jewish readers, look, accept the truth, even if it's a non-Jew who says it. If it's true, don't dismiss it or disregard it simply because it's not within our own tradition. And he continues, sometimes I've taken a complete passage from the text of a famous book. Now he means from really outside the Jewish tradition. Now there is nothing wrong with that, for I do not attribute to myself what someone who preceded me said. We hereby acknowledge this and shall not indicate that so-and-so said, X, Y, or Z. So one might think, oh, he's plagiarizing, but that's not the case. That's not the point. He makes clear that this is a pedagogical strategy in not assigning names to some of the passages that he's trying to circulate among Jews. He says the name of such an individual who wrote the passage that he's incorporating might make the passage offensive to someone without experience and make him think it has an evil inner meaning of which he is not aware. Consequently, I saw fit to omit the non-Jewish author's name since my goal is to be useful to the reader. So Maimonides is saying, I may be quoting, let's say, Aristotle or some Muslim theologian whom Maimonides believed had reached great heights of intellectual wisdom and truth. But if he had attached those names to those passages, most Jews in his society would have rejected his right, would have rejected Maimonides' pedagogy, thinking, oh, we're not supposed to be reading these outside sources. And Maimonides is saying, no, you can. If we identify that something is useful for purposes of our human project of reaching truth, you can hear the truth from whoever says it, whether Jewish or not. And then Maimonides makes clear that in this very famous passage from the Guide to the Perplexed, that our ultimate goal is this intellectual, rational knowledge of God. And very importantly, he makes clear that the Torah, although useful for that mandate, for that human project, is not fully self-sufficient. Maimonides believed the Torah was a wonderful system of creating a society and orienting Jews toward certain proper intellectual convictions about the world and about God. But it's not self-sufficient. We have to go sort of beyond the Torah, engage in philosophical understanding and investigation in order really to reach our fullest potential. Maimonides wrote in the guide, our ultimate fulfillment consists of winning the intellectual virtues, the conceptual thinking that yields sound views of divinity. This is our highest goal, truly perfecting the self, an attainment indeed one's own, winning immortality. And he means that literally, that to have a share of the world to come, one needs to have certain true and correct convictions about the world and about God. And by the way, that the world to come is not an exclusively Jewish domain. There could be non-Jews who reach the same levels of truth, who can have a share in the world to come. But we need to have those intellectual achievements in order to do so. Winning immortality by fulfilling in oneself what makes a human a human. So again, from Maimonides, what makes a person human in reaching our full potential is to use our minds. And then, perhaps, quite provocatively, he writes, all those biblical practices, and he means all the whole system of mitzvot, the acts of piety and morality so beneficial in our human interactions, hold not a candle to this ultimate goal of intellectual perfection, but only pave the way to it. So that's not a traditional thing for a great Jewish thinker to write, that the mitzvot, the commandments, the elements of the Torah are sort of a handmaid to the more general human project of perfecting our intellect and reaching truths about the natural world and about God. I'm going to just a couple of last sources and then open it up to any questions. A lot of what I said hopefully sounds fairly provocative to your Jewish ears. And there were Jews through the centuries who actually couldn't believe that the great Rambam, the great Maimonides, would have written such things. So here's just an example. A rabbinic figure, Shem Tov ben Yosef ibn Shem Tov in Spain in the 15th century, commenting on the Guide to the Perplexed, this passage in part 3, chapter 51, and I didn't include it, but what that is Maimonides lays out sort of a very detailed hierarchy of spiritual and religious and intellectual attainment. And it almost sounds like you can be and I think this is what Maimonides meant, you could be a great philosopher and reach great intellectual achievements and knowledge about God without ever having heard of the Torah. And that sounds, to most traditional Jews through the centuries, that sounds preposterous. So this rabbinic figure writes many, and this is the 15th century, many rabbinic scholars said that Rambam did not even write this chapter of the Guide to the Perplexed. And if he did write it, it ought to be hidden away or most appropriately burned. For how could Maimonides have said that those who know physics are on the higher level or on a higher level than those who engage in religion? And by that he means Jewishness, Torah. and even more, that they are with the ruler in the inner chamber. That means that philosophers or those who engage, and by philosophy for Maimonides, that means a scientifically based philosophical understanding of the world, that they are closer to God than the Jewish masses who fulfill all 613 mitzvot of the Torah and many hundreds more in the rabbinic tradition. How could Maimonides have possibly said that? For on this basis, the scholars who are engaged with physics and metaphysics have achieved a higher level than those engaged with Torah. And so this is a sort of a perplexity about what Maimonides wrote in the Guide of the Perplexed that attended a lot of traditional readers of the Maimonides' philosophical work, either believing, no, Maimonides could not possibly, and they referred to him as the Rambam, thinking he's referring to his sort of traditional role as halachic decisor. He couldn't possibly have written that scientifically inclined, informed non-Jewish philosophers are on a higher level than most of us Jews who are engaged in Torah study. But Maimonides indeed wrote that in the Guide of the Perplexed. I want to end, my last source today is, before I show it to you, I will say, I believe this is the most provocative thing I will present to you today. And when I was preparing for this class, one of the scholars I really found very helpful. So in addition to Warren Zev Harvey, who sort of started me on my journey of Jewish intellectual study, in addition to Warren Harvey, in addition to Isidore Twersky, who was a very important scholar at Harvard for many years, David Hartman, there are a range of scholars that I found most compelling in terms of how they presented Maimonides. Another is Menachem Kellner, who is an American who made Aliyah many years ago, was a professor of Jewish philosophy for decades at the University of Haifa, also involved in the Shalem Institute. But I find Kellner's presentation of Maimonides very compelling, and he depicts Maimonides in ways that even I found very provocative, but I think that his presentation is coherent, and he's taken his depiction of Maimonides to its logical consequences and implications. So in a really interesting article about the ways in which, if you recall Marc Shapiro, who was the scholar at the Shabbaton in my honor last year at Or Zarua, Marc Shapiro wrote a whole book about how traditional Jews sometimes correct prior writings or images that they find non-traditional. Menachem Kellner has a whole article about ways in which that happened to Maimonides too, that when Maimonides writes something that more traditional Jews find objectionable or unsettling, they actually sometimes change the text. This is, of course, before printing, or even now, sometimes in traditional circles, in printed versions of Maimonides' work. They correct Maimonides in order to improve Maimonides, make him more traditional. But within that interesting article, Menachem Kellner, really building on the themes that I've tried to present about the universalistic nature of Maimonides' thought, writes very provocatively, Israel's election is the result of a historical accident, plain and simple. It was Abraham the Hebrew who discovered God. Had a Navajo Indian been the first person to discover God following the decline in humanity after the generation of Adam's grandson Enosh, that person's tribe would have become the chosen people. The Torah would have been given in the Navajo language. The historical parts of the Torah would have dealt with Navajo history, and the Promised Land, presumably, would have been in Nevada. And Kellner, this is provocative, but I think an accurate way to present Maimonides' thought, that as I showed earlier, Maimonides' depiction of Abraham's religious journey was that it was purely through his own initiative, Abraham's own initiative as a non-Jew, that Abraham discovered God proceeding and without the assistance of the Torah, free of intervention by God directly to Abraham. Abraham made those discoveries by himself, by investigating the natural world beyond him and reaching certain informed conclusions that all human beings, Jews and non-Jews, could reach as well, according to the level of the capacity of their intellects. But that is really sort of an historical accident, that it happened to be Avraham and not someone else who did it. Kellner gives the very sort of useful, straightforward, simple example that the Torah itself, the laws of the Torah, are not inevitable. He gives the example of shatnez, the prohibition against wearing clothes of wool and linen together. Maimonides said the reason for the law of shatnez in the Torah is because the idolatrous priests at the time of the Torah wore clothing with that combination. Had those idolatrous priests worn polyester outfits, then the law in the Torah would have been we can't wear polyester. So the way Kellner presents Maimonides, I think compellingly, is that the details of the Jewish legal system are not inevitable, and are not self-evident, were not sort of part of the fabric of creation. And I will note, I think that comports with the thought of my teacher, David Weiss Halivni, who believed that the Jewish legal system had its own dynamic, had its own logic that did not necessarily comport precisely with objective scientific truth or reality beyond the Jewish legal system. The Jewish legal system has its own rules and reaches its own conclusions that don't necessarily comport with sort of objective divine scientific truth. And this notion that the Torah itself is contingent is not a traditional Jewish thought. I think it is a fair way to present Maimonides' thought, and a fair way to understand why Maimonides was controversial, why he was so provocative, why there was outrage about some of the conclusions he reached. And I will get back to all of those issues in further detail in subsequent sessions. So I will stop there for today and welcome any questions. If you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask away.
Okay, Mark.
Yes, Charlie.
It's Charlie. All right. Some of this has always been a challenge for me. I really don't know what the state of physics was at the time of Maimonides. Someone like me doesn't start to think about physics until classical physics came into mode, Newtonian mechanics, classical mechanics, Newtonian mechanics, and there's all sorts of other mechanics we've added on to that. But there's one of the reasons that Maimonides is asking us to study other disciplines and become expert at them, if I'm understanding you correctly, is if once you understand all those things and also understand what God is trying to tell us, that we would become stronger believers in God.
Right. So let me address both parts of your comment, Charlie. One is the way I'm going to present Maimonides, and I think the way he should be approached is that he can be a role model for us. Yes, he lived in the early medieval period. His science was not our science. I think what he would tell you, Charlie, is use the best physics and other sciences of your day to understand the world better than I did. So his approach is what I think can be the paradigm for us.
And that would still hold.
Yes, that's right. So his pedagogy would still hold. The science has changed, but not necessarily the approach. The second part of your question is, we'll get back into this in more detail in subsequent sessions, but the whole purpose of human life for Maimonides, not just Jewish life, is to encourage us to develop a relationship with God. So it's really only in that narrow sense that he could be said to have any sort of mystical inclination, I think. There are some scholars who believe he became a mystic later. I don't find that evidence compelling. Um, but he believed that we could achieve a sort of intellectual union with God, that is the fulfillment of our human potential by developing our intellectual understanding of the world. And through that knowledge, we will come to love God more. So again, he was a fervent, God-focused person, a strict monotheist, and for him, that was the purpose of our existence, not happiness, not anything else you might substitute. For Maimonides, it was getting to know and understand God better, which meant using our minds and our access to the natural sciences to the best of our ability.
Deb's got a question.
Yep.
I have a question too. So what would his ideas be on performing mitzvot that are so evident in the Torah, the 613? And also I find the story compelling that Abraham broke the idols in his father's shop all on his own, that famous story.
Right. Yeah. So, I didn't hear the beginning of it, but the question, if you asked about Maimonides' approach to the mitzvot, he was absolutely not antinomian, which means he wrote the Mishnah Torah, which is a great code of Jewish law. He believed Jews absolutely had to observe all the biblical and rabbinic commandments. That's why he wrote the Mishnah Torah. And I'll get back to the novelty of the Mishnah Torah itself, just in short, was that he wanted to make the Talmud accessible to the Jewish masses. He didn't think most of them had the capacity or time to deal with the Talmud. He wanted them to have a book, his book, in which he reached certain conclusions about particulars of Jewish law that they could consult. So in no way can Maimonides be accused of advising Jews not to perform the mitzvot. Some of his later followers were accused of being antinomian and anti-law in that sense, but no one says that about Maimonides himself. But he had a different conception of the purpose of the mitzvot. They were not ends in themselves. They were a means to allow us to create a society, to be part of a community, and to provoke within us, getting us more along the path to correct theological beliefs about God. So the commandments, all of them, there are many more than 613, have a utilitarian purpose for Maimonides within our society and to refine our own minds. But they were means to the larger human mandate of intellectual knowledge of God.
Not an end in itself. It was not an end in itself.
No, not an end, right. There were means
that
to.
Not enough there.
Correct. Right. You had to, he believed that if you had the capacity, you had to go beyond.
It was a conduit.
Right. Which is why he encouraged consulting true and reliable sources from beyond our tradition.
Yeah.
Jerry Arenheim, I see you have a hand up.
I'd like to know a little bit more about where the word science, as we translate it into English, comes from. What was really the word that we translate into science now? Because what we call science today is quite different. In those days, was more observation and logic, which I guess are predecessors of science. Is that a reasonable way to put it? I'm a little bit uncomfortable using the word science.
That is a reasonable way to put it. And the simple answer is, I don't know what the word is because it was Judeo-Arabic, and I don't know Judeo-Arabic. So there was a word that reliable translators have told me means physics and metaphysics. I think you're right. Science had a different meaning, a different context in those times. I'm not an expert about those differences, but yes, it is based on investigation of the natural world, philosophy in the sense that we understood it, reaching logical conclusions about those investigative results. So yes, science meant something different, but it is translatable to us in terms of using our rational minds to the best of our ability, using the most advanced sources of that knowledge, scientifically, logically, philosophically.
Thank you.
Hal,
Yeah, two questions. One is, you mentioned very early on about how his brother's death affected him. So, is that you're getting to the idea of theodicy? You know, how does he explain or how does he justify or understand that concept? And the second was, you know, he's so involved in medicine, physician, and the natural world, if you will, rationality, and yet, how does he reconcile that with his faith? Because they're sort of dialectics. You know, you have the enlightenment versus faith.
Hal, I'm sorry. Could you just repeat the last part of your question? I'm not
Just the dialect of rationality and reason and science
Right.
versus God and faith.
Okay, so all right, let me address. Those are two important questions. I'm going to cover in more detail Maimonides' view about divine providence and sort of the active role of God in history. It's a complicated topic that I'm going to tackle in a subsequent session. What I meant about his being significantly affected by the death of his brother, I'm not sure that had any material impact on his philosophical views. Personally, it had a big impact. I think for several years, Maimonides was sort of consumed with sadness about his brother. He was still incredibly productive throughout his life in terms of his writings, his daily activities. So I'm not sure it inhibited his productivity, but I've read that he was personally affected by it. The second question, though, touches on sort of the core of what I was trying to get at in an important way. For Maimonides, sort of philosophical truth and faith are the same thing. There's no faith, there's no uninformed faith about God for Maimonides. Your faith, in terms of your religious beliefs, he believed, had to be as philosophically informed as possible. And if you had improperly or sort of insufficiently informed beliefs, then you weren't in a great situation. So that's why I had a source about beliefs have to be sort of well thought out. Maimonides did not believe in pure faith without being based on an intellectual foundation. So for him, they were sort of the same thing. To achieve proper religious faith, ideally, it would be rationally, philosophically sophisticated. Rabbi.
Mark, thank you for an amazing shiur. Your lecture this morning, as always, crystal clear, and your addition and knowledge about Rambam. I believe you're helping us all fulfill what the Rambam was asking us to conceive of our relationships to the divine and making God a little closer to each of us. And that's really, really intensely Jewish. And therefore, I'll vote already if we're taking polls at each class. Major contributor, maybe one of the most incredible Jews, not a heretic, even though some of the quoted texts would cause a little stir in our world of people quick to judge. I agree. I'm reminded of a conversation about the Aristotelian notion of cosmology that informs, I think, Jerry's question, that a lot of the science was, in essence, Aristotelian understandings of the cosmos. And Judeo-Arabic, I know very little, but I know, since the beginning of the guide is so important that all the rabbinical students are required to work with it, that ilm is the word for knowledge and science. It comes from the root lamed mem dalet, or a shared ancient root. And it means about learning out and observing qualitatively, quantitatively. And it's the Arabic word, I believe, still today for science. So as to that matter, I do agree that there's a certain kind of question as to what exactly he would want us to learn. And getting to Charlie's point about Newtonian and these things, I'm constantly looking at the Rambam as being, though, open enough in our interpretation, the way Kellner might have pushed it and shown that Rambam is understood lots of different ways, that we should push into these worlds of science as they have developed, that he was open to in his time. So his openness becomes a matter of the way we read him and the attitudes that he has. And so I'm wondering about his attitude even more as a person. We know about him as a physician, and we know about him as a real human being, as your biography really influenced a lot of the thinking. Could you go back to that and think about the Rambam's personality as you saw it come out of these initial texts that you presented today? Do you think that really he was writing with a different set of eyes and a heart and human experience because of any of the biographical details that you shared?
So, Robbie, you raised a few important points. One is I do totally agree with and want to reiterate, for all his sort of philosophical sophistication, what is at the center of Maimonides' mandate to us is to grow closer to God. So, that I agree, that's the essence of sort of Jewishness and of the Jewish tradition. So in that sense, Maimonides, the Rambam was perfectly traditional in fostering a relationship with God. He had a particular view about how we could achieve that was different from other Jews and certainly different from later, Kabbalists. Second thing, I just want to be clear for anyone who had any doubt, I do think he's one of the greatest Jews of all time. I discussed with you, he's on my Mount Rushmore of Jews, my top 4. If anyone wants to have a discussion with me, that would be great. Not that I agree with everything he wrote, but just in terms of the significance of Maimonides to the Jewish tradition, and the role he played in Jewish history, I think is really unparalleled, almost after the biblical period. The last thing about his sort of biography, I think what comes through, I'm not sure I can comment on any particular biographical details, but I think what comes through clearly, and I tried to suggest this, but we'll get into it further, is that Maimonides addressed different audiences with great care, and he did so differently. So, the Guide of the Perplexed is directed to a sophisticated, he says this at the beginning of the guide, it's directed to a sophisticated student who's troubled by the apparent inconsistencies between Judaism and philosophy. But that's a different audience from the one he tried to reach through the Mishnah Torah, which I think he really did try to make Judaism almost more democratic, more accessible to the Jewish masses. So they didn't have to, first of all, they didn't have to consult the Talmud, but Maimonides was not a huge fan of his contemporary rabbinic leaders. He thought a lot of them were engaged in sort of incorrect beliefs about God and about the world, and he didn't love their style of leadership. So I think that was one of his purposes in writing the Mishnah Torah, was to reach the common Jew and allow the common Jew to fulfill his or her obligations, which again he absolutely thought Jews should do. And another important point is, despite the sort of austere philosophical bent to some of his thought and his clear elitism when it comes to what he thought people could accomplish, and that only a minority of people could accomplish what he thought our ultimate goal was. He cared deeply about the Jewish community, and that's I mentioned he has really vast correspondence and responsa with communities all over the Jewish world who appeal to him for advice, for intervention. There's an important episode in which Jews were taken captive, which has, of course, resonance for us today. And Maimonides was consulted about what the approach of the community should be to getting those captives back. So, despite the heights of his philosophical thought, he was deeply engaged on a daily basis with members of his community, both medically and halakhically, which I think showed his deep love for the Jewish people.
I would just want to agree with you 100%, and I think that one of the radical things he might have said, which for some did sound heretical, is that with the redeeming of captives, he's held up right as the one who says it is, if not the most important mitzvah, the essential mitzvah for the Jewish community. In his time, this was a big problem, even at the expense, and he actually in the Mishnah Torah writes these out in a very deeply accessible and realistic way so that everybody should participate, even over the priority of giving tzedakah, and that our resources need to be directed there. So his texts have been in use, by the way, in that debate that we have raging now on day 569. May they all be freed this hour.
Right.
So fantastic uses of Rambam within the community as of this moment.
Yeah, just to a postscript to what the rabbi just said, it demonstrates Maimonides' incredible stature within the Jewish community. His views, his halachic writings are still debated within the contemporary Jewish world. They're cited again and again, and not always in accurate ways. There are competing sort of camps within the Jewish world, within the traditional Jewish world, who use Maimonides because of his great stature for their own purposes. And as I noted at the beginning, I think sometimes misinterpreting him either inadvertently or purposefully to suit their own agendas. But it's because of his immense stature that his views are still important. The rabbi mentioned about the hostages, but also very prominently about the boundaries of the state of Israel. So politically, Maimonides has become sort of used and abused in terms of how his stature can be exploited to support competing views about political reality in the modern state of Israel. Okay, we're running late. I think I'm going to end there. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them or address them by email or in person. But I look forward to hopefully you joining me again next week as we explore the incredible world of Maimonides in further detail.
Thank you so much, Mark.
My pleasure. So have a good rest of the day, everyone. Be well.
Thank you, Mark.
Fantastic. Hope to see everybody at Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut on Wednesday evening, this year especially, to honor all those who've fallen and to just get a little sense of culture going about an Israeli film with some lovely humorous. We'll have a Nash. And I want to say again, Mark, Yishar Kochacha, and great start to what will be a great series.
And by the way,
Thanks, Mark.
Next,
Rabbi, I believe Maimonides would have endorsed everything that Or Zarua does. So
amen.
attend those programs.
I'm going to set up a Zoom at the synagogue next week, and hopefully we'll have a strong morning of davening together and then learning with Mark. And so, Mark, if that makes a difference as to your location or not, I'll let you decide, but I'm available to do that next Sunday. I thought I was not going to be able to be here today, so I really want to encourage everybody to come back and also maybe we'll make it a davening morning and a learning morning together at Or Zarua.
Right. Well, thank you. I appreciate everyone's attendance today. Have a good rest of the weekend.
Bye, Mark.
Stay well.
Good to see you, Sharon.
Yes, and you are without your picture, but you too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.